What's up, everybody? I'm just going to do a couple of quick reviews today of some books I've been really loving. The first of which was a recent shortlisted book for the Booker Prize. I think it's the most known of these three. The second one is incredibly niche, and if anybody has heard of this book, I would be genuinely surprised. And then the third book is from a very well-known author, but a very niche book from her backlist. Recently republished in a really interesting way, so I want to talk about it. The first book is The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden. Since it has been Booker shortlisted, I'm not going to talk too much about the plot of the book itself. I think people who are interested probably know a little bit about it, but I will tell you what my thoughts are because this is one of my favorite novels I've read in the last 5 years, easily. This is a book that I would recommend so wholeheartedly to anybody who's interested in books about shame and despair, but in ultimately a hopeful way. Also, books that hinge on an attention to detail. While the book is super readable, it's full of tension, I think it's a slow burn that requires your careful consideration to fully get everything out of it. But every ounce of that effort is worth it. This book is so extraordinary. It's a novel that describes itself as being about the seduction of disobedience. St. Augustine actually eloquently wrote about this same feeling way back when. The idea of luxuriating in something that you know is wrong, or at least you are told it's wrong. There's a quote from him that I think represents a lot of what's going on in this novel, in that it was foul and I loved it. I loved my own undoing. Cannot comprehend that this thing came out of a first-time author. I'm just awestruck by the confidence of this woman to write something so understated and yet so just chock full of detail. In order to do that, you have to be so unbelievably trusting of your readers, to listen, to look, to let the book unfold, to let the story unfold as it needs to. I think there are readers who struggle with this novel because there's very little overt commentary about what is actually happening. Everything that's going on is being talked about, it's just not being talked about, if you know what I mean. For example, the sexual tension in this novel is ever present, but it's felt as, quote, a shuddering shame at something she couldn't name. The underlying mystery of the book doesn't even rear its head until the third act, like at all. You don't even know really there's a mystery being set up until the third act. The story takes place in, I think, 1961. For most of the story, that framing feels almost arbitrary until the moment it suddenly doesn't. And then the entire novel is recolored in an instant for you. And when you finish, everything that has been said and then left unsaid just makes perfect sense in retrospect, given the novel's theme of shame and avoidance and repression. Simply put, this is one of the most rewarding reading experiences, not only that I've had recently, but perhaps ever. If you're someone who is on the fence about reading The Safekeep, if anything I just said sounds interesting, please read it and take your time, even take notes. I took lots of notes while I read it. It was so gratifying and so rewarding. This novel is extraordinary. The next book I'm gonna talk about is super niche, but please stick with me. If not for this book, but for the book after that. It's Melville by Rodrigo Fresan. And you'll notice Melville, as in Herman Melville, is spelled kind of with the E, kind of not with the E, very much on purpose. This is a invented biography about the father of Herman Melville, and then also, in part, Melville himself. Herman Melville's father died in the grips of a delirious fever, and Melville himself in this book is kind of collecting at the very end the final thoughts of this hallucinating man and trying to put together some coherent narrative of his life, who he was, what he cared for, his journeys, his ruin, and all the things about his father that ultimately shape Herman. It's interesting to note that Herman Melville, who spelled Melville with an E, grew up as Melville with an L. He added the E to distance himself from his father, from his reputation, from his debts. And this book is very much him wrestling with his father's past and how that integrates with his own, and the effects that his father had on him, had on his life, had on his creative life. As a result of that, this book is recommended extraordinarily highly for people who are interested in the life of Herman Melville. I don't think it's enough to just be a fan of Melville's books. I think you have to genuinely be interested in his life, which I think is so interesting and I've become so fascinated by. That's why I read this book in the first place. I'm on very much a Melville kick over the last couple of months. And then given that I think stylistically the book is kind of a more accessible version of a book that maybe David Foster Wallace would write, with tons of footnotes, tons of detail. It just meanders all over the place, but eventually comes back to exactly where you know it needs to go. And it's written by a genius and an absolute master. I've become obsessed with Fresan after reading this book, and I'm so excited to read his trilogy of books that starts with The Invented Part. That'll be coming up pretty soon on this channel, I would imagine. So yeah, Melville is wildly niche, but thankfully I fall exactly in the center of this very unique Venn diagram. I loved it, but I think results may vary. I think this book is a Melville nerd's dream. It's wildly detailed. It is chock full of lore, both existing and invented. It has these insanely specific but borderline unnecessary tangents, which if anyone's read Moby Dick, they understand very well. It's positively drowning in minutia. Like, this book is for almost no one. I don't know why I'm talking about it publicly. But Fresan, Fresan, what a writer. His ability to craft a sentence that just goes on and on and on, and yet never loses the thread. It never loses your interest. There's almost a momentum that happens with some of these sentences that just keep going and going and going. It's extraordinarily entertaining, I think, just at the sentence by sentence level, whether you care about the book or the story or not. And I'm equally, I should say, I'm equally in awe of translator Will van der Heijden, who is in the middle of translating, I think, all of Fresan's work into English for the first time. This book also introduced me to him as well, and I've listened to him in a couple interviews on a few podcasts, and just, man, what a gift, what an absolute gift this book has been on both fronts for me, both for Fresan and for van der Heijden. How good is this combo? The Invented Part won the 2018 Best Translated Book Award for fiction. Like any work of Melville himself, this book will go unappreciated in its own time, and that's fine. It does seem fitting at the end of the day. The last book I want to talk about today is Twilight Sleep by Edith Wharton, which is one of the first books published by the new imprint Smith and Taylor Classics, which, if you didn't know, is the imprint from famous author Brandon Taylor and also his co-founder Allison Miriam Smith. What's cool about this imprint is that they're taking forgotten classics, or maybe not talked enough about classics. I think they're doing about a dozen every year, republishing them in this beautiful new format and including conversations about the novels, why they've been chosen, maybe why they've been forgotten about, why it makes sense to republish these books now and talk about them now. One of the first books that they've published is Twilight Sleep, a very forgotten book, I think, in the Wharton oeuvre. What I loved about this is the time period in which this is set. It's set much later than what you would expect from a Wharton novel. It's very much a kind of sardonic takedown of the jazz age. It's about sex and drugs and the occult and spiritual healing. It's about a bunch of people looking to escape the boredom and maybe even emptiness of their lives with all of these other things. It was truly nothing like what I expected it to be. Wharton was also, I think, in her 70s when she wrote this, so she also has that air of someone later in their life looking at these younger people living their lives this way and kind of disapproving of some of these modern fads and fashions and maybe what it means to broader society that these things are happening. I think she's genuinely on the far side of greatness in this novel. I think she's kind of past her prime, but I find that fascinating. If you're someone who has read Wharton before, just seeing the trajectory of her career in light of this book is really, really interesting. Because it's not by any means a bad book at all. I actually think I described it to somebody as like, this might be the best 3-star book I've ever read. I wouldn't be shocked if at a later point in my life I reread this, maybe at a time when I'm more tuned for it, and I find a 5-star book there. I wouldn't be shocked at all. So why is it called Twilight Sleep? The term Twilight Sleep referred to a method of childbirth that involved not just morphine, but the morphine combined with something else. I've lost the name of it. To induce almost this sense of amnesia and sleepiness during your pregnancy. So in the book, Wharton is using that as a metaphor for how people are using all these different things: sex, drugs, money, spiritual healing to, I guess, medicate themselves through life's stresses. It's shockingly modern, and this can be applied very much to how people are using maybe online accesses today to avoid coming to terms with, day-to-day stresses and also just the general hardness of life. As a way to kick off this new imprint, I think it's just such a perfect choice. The idea of using this as a book that's almost 100 years old, repurposing it today. It's a story that very much feels applicable to what's going on. Told in a very, very different way, of course, with very, very different people in a very, very different setting. But I thought it was just such a perfect choice. I think the story itself felt a little bit wanting, but I think as a conversation piece, it offers a heck of a lot.